Okay, for this video, we are going to do a lapped zipper. Before we begin, let's make sure you have all the supplies necessary. First, you'll need 2 pieces of muslin for doing your sample, your zipper, something to mark with, a ruler, and pens. Now, I'm going to show you the exact steps you need to follow for completing your sample, but these steps can also be applied to your regular garments. So first we're going to start by lining up our 2 pieces of muslins along the edge. And we need to draw our seam allowance line. We want to do a 5/8 seam allowance. So I'm going to mark that right here. Now the first steps for sewing a lapped zipper are very similar to the centered zipper. We're marking our seam allowance line. We're going to do the same stop mark that we did in the centered zipper. Going to do that now. I'm lining up the top of my zipper with the top edge of my sample. Right here is my zipper stop, and I want to, from right underneath, go across and make a mark through my seam allowance line. This tells me where I switch from a regular stitch length to a basting stitch. Now, just like we did in the centered zipper, I'm going to mark the top edge and the bottom edge. Just like with the centered zipper, we want to always sew the same direction for our zipper. For this lapped zipper, I'm going to sew from the bottom to the top. So from this mark to the bottom, I want to use a number 3 stitch length. I need to back stitch right here, and of course here when I start. From this mark to the top, I want to do a number 5 stitch length or our basting length, whatever the longest stitch length you have on your sewing machine. Okay, let's take this to the sewing machine. So now we're going to sew our seam allowance. Again, I'm starting at the bottom and working my way to the top. I'm going to start right here using a number 3 stitch length. I'm going to start with a back stitch, continue until I get to this stop mark, and then back stitch again. Very important that we back stitch right there. Now I'm going to change my stitch length to the largest stitch length on this machine, and then I will continue sewing to the end. Now at the end you can back stitch if you like. I'm choosing not to. All right, now our stitch is in. My needle caught the muslin a little bit there. And now we're ready to take this to the iron. Now we're going to press our seam open. So I'm going to open up my sample, open up my seam, press it open nice and flat. Just like that. Now that we've pressed open our seam, we are ready to begin installing our zipper. So just like with the centered zipper, we're going to install the first step to just the seam allowance. We're going to install it to the left side seam allowance, and I'll show you that in a moment. And remember, you have a right side and a wrong side to your zipper. We want to place the right side down. Before I do that though, I want to work with this seam allowance. So I'm going to tuck this edge under. And to make it a little easier on myself, I'm actually going to rotate my sample so that my top is close to me and my bottom is further away from me. I need the top right side of the zipper to go down on top of my seam allowance just like this. So I'm going to start with the top, make sure my zipper pull is up, and I'm going to pin to just the seam allowance. As I go, roll my zipper teeth down this sewn seam, holding it in place while I pin in just the seam allowance. I'm going to take this step nice and slow so that my zipper teeth are right on top of this edge. Use as many pins as you need. Just remember that as you're sewing, you'll have to remove the pins, so don't overpin. Last little bit right there. Okay, so let's take this to the sewing machine, and remember we're sewing from the bottom towards the top. Now, before I begin sewing my zipper onto the seam allowance, I need to change out my presser foot. So I'm going to push the lever in the back to release my regular presser foot and attach my zipper foot. I want to attach it on the left side. Got a short tail here, so I'm going to pull that thread just a little longer so my needle doesn't come unthreaded. And I'm starting at the bottom and working my way up to the top. Now, look very closely at your zipper. In the seam allowance here, there is a ridged line right there. Do you see that? That is your guideline when you're sewing on a zipper. For our lap zipper, this is really important, and we want to try to sew right on top of that line. If you're having a hard time seeing that line, feel free to grab a marker or a pencil and darken that line. So I'm going to stitch just right on top of that line using my zipper foot and removing my pins as I go. I'm still using a basting stitch, which is fine. All right, now our zipper is basted on. Let's take it to the table so I can show you what the next step looks like. Okay, so now I have my zipper just attached to the seam allowance on the left side. To make this step a little easier, I'm going to rotate this around so the top is closest to me and the bottom is the furthest away from me. Now my zipper is wrong side up, right side down. I'm going to take my zipper and fold it up, but just the zipper and not all of this yet. So we're going to get in real close here. You can kind of see when I pull on it, you can see our seam edge right here. So we want to move this seam allowance so that it's close to the zipper teeth, but not over. Let's get in a little closer here. Can you see the seam line there and how it's folded over? We want to stitch right along this fold through both the zipper, the seam allowance that is folded over. To make this a little easier, I'm going to kind of gently scoot it towards my zipper teeth. I am going to pin this in place. Pin across this way. There's not a lot of clearance right here. That's okay. Just make sure that you sew slowly and carefully because you do not want to go over the seamed edge, which is right here. You've just got like an eighth of an inch of fabric to sew in. It's a very small amount. So pin if you need to, and go slowly and carefully when we take this back to the machine. Get this all pinned, and then I will hold it closer for you to take a look. Okay, see how my seam line is right here, and I've got the seam allowance folded over on itself? I want to stitch right here, right along the edge, and do not cross this seam line. Okay, let's take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to try and get my camera very close so you can see this in action. All right, now I'm going to stitch just on this folded edge right here, not crossing this line. And I'm going to start at the bottom of my zipper and work my way up. Now, right now, my zipper foot is actually in the wrong position, so we need to move our zipper foot to the opposite side. So the needle is closer to this edge. I'm going to make sure I have a long enough tail on my zipper, and that it is pushed to the right side now so it doesn't get wrapped around my zipper foot. Okay, and I get in right here. Oh, my zipper foot didn't catch. Hold on. Not properly attached. All right, there it goes. Okay. I'm going to run the edge of my presser foot, the zipper foot, right along this edge of the fold, and my needle won't catch this part. I'm going to go very, very slowly and carefully. One other thing to note is that I am not using a basting stitch for this step. I am using a regular stitch length. So we do want to back stitch here. There's my back stitch. I'm going to remove my pins as we go. We're going to go very slowly. Because again, you do not want to go over this seam line over here. Remove this pin. And back stitch at the end. Go as slowly and as carefully as you need to make sure that you do not jump over that basted seam line. Can you see that? Can you see how I stitched in just this part and I've still got the seam right there? All right, so that's this part of the lapped zipper. Let's take it back to the table and get ready for the next step. Now that we've done this seam line, we need to take our sample, open it up to the right side, and lay it as flat as we can. You will notice when you do this that our edge that we initially sewed is now no longer right on top of the zipper teeth. That's good. That's exactly what we want. So you lay this as flat as you can. If you need to, you can press it at the sewing machine, press it at the iron, excuse me. So now the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to hand sew a little basting line just for a mark. It's going to hold all of these layers together and it gives me a good place to begin my stitching line. So I'm going to feel for the zipper stop, which is right there. I'm going to go down about 1/2 inch, put my needle right here in the seam to hide my knot. I have a single threaded needle here. I did knot it. I'm actually going to pull that knot out a little bit because I want to remove the stitching later. So I'm going to take one little running stitch right here. And then I want to do my basting stitch up towards the top about 1/2 inch away from the edge. So I do have my needle coming out about 1/2 inch. So as I do this basting line, I'm going to periodically smooth out my fabric and recheck my length. I'm going to turn this sideways because I like sewing from left to right. Sorry, nope, the other way, right to left. Okay, so this is approximately 1/2 inch. So I want to do a little running stitch right here. Boop. All right, come down a little bit further. Yep. This is a basting stitch, so you're using the running hand stitch, but we're using nice long stitches because we don't want to have this be permanent. You will remove this later. So because this is muslin and it's quite thin, I can actually sort of see the color of my zipper through the muslin. You guys can't see that on the camera, but I can see it in person. And I'm noticing that 1/2 inch away from this edge is just barely catching the seam allowance on the opposite side. I'll flip this over so you can see. See a little tiny bit of seam allowance, just barely getting caught. So whenever I go to sew this, I want to, on the machine, stitch right next to my basting line, but I'm going to stitch on the inside so that I make sure I catch all of these layers. We do want to catch the seam allowance as well because if you don't, when you go to open the lapped zipper, the seam allowance will flip out. So it is important that you check and make sure you are catching the seam allowance. You should be fine if you followed your seam allowance guides correctly. Coming over here. Yep, right there. Gonna make sure my zipper is closed all the way. And I'm gonna put this to this side, grab the top of my zipper tape, and make sure that I can grab both the seam allowance and the zipper tape so that it doesn't move over. Okay, so I'm just going to unthread my needle. I'm just going to leave this thread here because I'm going to pull this back out. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine. I'm going to start at this seam right here and basically stitch exactly where this line is, but right next to it. If you would like to, if it makes it a little easier, you can measure your seam allowance and mark it with a pencil to stitch on top, or I like to use a friction pin because then I can iron it away and we don't have to worry about seeing that line. Okay, so let's take this back to the sewing machine. So now I'm ready for my last row of machine stitching. This is a regular stitch length, but if you notice whenever I go to put my fabric in, oh, it's getting caught on the bobbin thread. The bobbin thread got wrapped around the zipper foot. There we go. So if I go to sew, right now my zipper foot's on the right side, and I need to sew down this way. You always want your needle closer to the zipper teeth every time you're sewing. So I need to shift my zipper foot over to the left now. Okay, remember, as you're stitching this, do not sew over your basting line because you need to be able to remove it. So I'm going to put my presser foot down and very carefully lower my needle so that my needle is actually going into this seam line right here because I want to start there. Start going forward and then a back stitch. And I'm going to actually use the hand wheel to very precisely hit my corner. Needle down, presser foot up, turn my fabric. Okay. I'm going to follow my seam line. And actually, I can kind of feel the zipper teeth right here, and they're running right along this edge as well. Just going all the way down. Scoot this over to this side. Doesn't get caught. Now my zipper pull right here is kind of giving me a little grief. So I'm going to very carefully make sure that my zipper head doesn't get caught there. And back stitch at the top. Now I did manage to cross over my basting just a little bit. That's okay. It'll be really easy to pull out because I only caught it in one location. All right, so let's take this back to the table and remove all of our basting and get ready to rip this seam open. So now our zipper is all attached. Stop. Now our zipper is fully sewn in, but we still have some final cleanup work to do just like we did on the centered zipper. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clip my extra threads to make sure I don't have any crazy tails. I'm not clipping my basting thread because I want to be able to pull it out. I have a little knot here. I'm going to cut that out. So now I should just be able to take my basting thread tail and pull it straight out. It's going to kind of wrinkle on me. All right, my basting thread is removed. Now, still need to open up this seam. So I'm going to take my seam ripper and start at the bottom so that I make sure I don't cut through this back stitch. You do want the back stitch to go over this seam so that you've got that extra reinforcement. So I'm going to just start right above, very slowly and carefully open up this seam. Now, if this is troublesome or you're worried about this step, before you start to install your zipper, you can actually pre-cut every 5 or 6 stitches so that this stage is a little easier. I personally don't like to do that because I find with the way that I install my zippers, I tend to pull at that seam. And if I have clipped all of those seams, it comes apart on me. So I prefer the extra stability of all of those stitches being there. You just have to be really careful when you get to the seam ripping stage. Takes a little bit more work at this stage, but I'm okay with that. I'm just going up every couple of stitches and seam ripping my way down because I'm finding that that's a little easier on this step today. Okay, almost all the way through. There we go. Okay, so now this is open, and this is why this is called a lapped zipper, because the seam allowance is lapped over the zipper. It makes it mostly invisible. Actually, it makes the zipper fully invisible compared to the center zipper, which is also mostly invisible. So now we can use our zipper. And you're done. You're not quite done. You do need to go back and pull out all of these little threads from your seam ripping because, again, any threads close enough to the zipper teeth to get caught are likely to get caught, and you really would not want in the middle of a performance or a quick change to have your zipper get stuck halfway down and the performer not able to get out of their garment. So make sure you clear all those threads away so you don't damage your zipper teeth. And then you're done.